everybody. I'm Dr. Eugenia Constantinou for OCN, and we are continuing a series preparing us all for the Passion of Christ and the stories from the Gospels that we will hear during Holy Week. In the previous two episodes, we discussed first the background to the situation involving conflicts between the Lord and the Jewish leaders. I explained the various groups, what kind of arguments they had against Christ, the beefs that they had, the disputes that they had with him, and why. In the second of the various lessons that we have released, we discussed the three main catalysts to the arrest and crucifixion of Christ. And those three key events were the raising of Lazarus, the entry into Jerusalem, and the cleansing of the temple. In the next lesson, not this one, we will hear how, especially the cleansing of the temple, was key to the condemnation at the trial of Christ. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk about Judas, one of the most enigmatic figures of the Bible, and we're going to discuss who he was, possibly why he betrayed Christ, or what we can say about that, and also the arrest of the Lord. All right, so let's get started now. By the way, I also want to say that I'm giving you some of the information, but there's a lot more information in my book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, which was published by Ancient Faith Publishing. This has a lot of historical details, also some patristic comments, some medical information about what happened to the Lord, and lots of other things, certainly also historical and legal information. It's also available in Greek translation. So, and also in Korean translation, but I don't have one of those, and also in Romanian, and I don't have a copy of that either. So let's go ahead and talk about Judas. The scandal of Judas is something that was very shocking to the early church. And the fact that the Gospels talk about Judas and how he was betrayed by the Lord and other things is that were extremely scandalous at the time, shows us how honest the evangelists are. They didn't hide anything that happened to Christ. And the betrayal by one of the 12 was considered a tremendous scandal at that time. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons why people said that Jesus Christ could not possibly be the Messiah or the Son of God, because he was betrayed by one of his own. We don't really see that in some other sort of epic figures in antiquity. So people were saying that Judas must have really known the truth about Jesus, and this is why he betrayed him, etc. But let's go ahead and talk about what we do know about Judas. And in terms of the motivations for his betrayal, well, this is something which people have discussed endlessly for centuries. We're going to talk about it and get to the bottom of it. What do we know about Judas? We don't know very much. All we know about is what has become known as sort of his last name, Judas Iscariot. Of course, it's not really his last name. People didn't have last names back then. They were known as the son of, usually. It could be something like my name, Constantinou, means of Constantine. So it's the son or daughter of somebody named Constantine. I'm not talking about Constantine the Great. The parent or maybe grandparent was Constantine, and so this becomes a family name of Constantine. So you see the same thing in the New Testament. You have James and John, the sons of Zebedee, right? Sometimes people were known for other reasons, like we have in the Bible, Simon the leper. Well, he's no longer a leper. He has Jesus at his house. But at one time, he must have been a leper, and that name or that description of him remained. Or there's one of the arch enemies of St. Paul, Alexander the coppersmith. So that person is known by his trade. Or you have Mary Magdalene. She's known because of where she came from. She came from this particular village of Magdala. Well, so what can we say about Judas, named Iscariot in English? In Greek, it's Iskariotis. The difficulty that we have is that he was a Jew, and he was from, obviously, Judea or Galilee, where people were speaking Aramaic. all we have is the Greek word Iskariotes. That's the closest we can get, but we don't know exactly how that sounded in Aramaic or how it would have been spelled. So we have to go with what sounds similar to Iskariotes in Aramaic. One of the closest, probably the closest, is Kariot. Kariot. Could Iskariotes be Greek, the Greek version of Kariot? If that's the case, then it would simply mean that Judas was from a village in Judea called Kariot. That's a possibility. Not very interesting, but it's possible, like Mary Magdalene is known for her place name. It also sounds, Iskariotes in Greek also sounds like the Aramaic word for dyer or red, dyer, D-Y-E-R. In other words, a person who dyes cloth, or the color red. It also sounds, and this is rather a tantalizing idea, sounds like the Aramaic word for a false person, the false one, sequariae. Sequariae, not as much as Kiriot, but sequariae. Iskariotes or sequariae is possible. Sequaria, Iscariote, Sequaria, I'm not sure. But it's tantalizing because it might be, and I think it remains a possibility, that he got this moniker after the crucifixion, after he was discovered by the 11 to have been a false disciple. Is that a possibility? It's a possibility. The one that has been proposed, which is the most popular, is actually the least likely, and that is Sicarii. And that's the word for dagger man. The Sicarii was a group of zealots who, unfortunately for us, for our theory, or at least for the theory of people who propose this, really weren't formed until closer to the time of the Jewish revolt against Rome in the 60s. And of course, Judas is probably not part of that group because that group doesn't exist. And why wouldn't he have been called simply Judas the Zealot? If he was a zealot, we already have Simon the Zealot, right, among the disciples. The other Judas, the son of Alphaeus, or this James, the son of Alphaeus, they are known by other names. So if the reason why Judas has some kind of a description is because there were two Judases among the disciples. If he was a zealot or a member of some kind of a revolutionary group, or maybe very passionate by nature, he might have been called zealot. I don't think he's a dagger man. I don't think that he was a revolutionary. One of the reasons why people like that explanation is because it kind of gives us some possible other motivation for his betrayal of Christ. And that's why I think they like it. It also seems to add an element of intrigue or mystery. So let's talk about that. Could he have been this kind of a zealot, or even if he doesn't exactly belong to a group called the Sicarii? And could there be some other explanation for why he betrayed Christ? There doesn't really seem to be, other than what we have in the Gospels. In other words, our best option for trying to figure out what possible motivation Judas might have had would be what the Gospels tell us. And they don't tell us that there was a political motivation. In other words, the people who suggest that perhaps he was a violent revolutionary are suggesting that Judas really wanted Jesus to start a revolt against Rome, and Jesus refused to do that, so Judas betrayed him. And although this seems to be kind of appealing on an emotional level, we might say there's no historical basis for it. And in fact, we do have in the Gospels a motivation, and that motivation is money. Money. He was a greedy guy. He sold the Lord out for money. Well, this, of course, would assume that he doesn't really believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Maybe he might have still thought he could be the Messiah, maybe not the promised Messiah, but certainly he was a messianic figure. So why would Judas sell out Jesus for money? But this is exactly what we see. We see that in the Gospel of Matthew. It is Judas who goes to the chief priests, and what does he say? He says, "What will you give me if I hand him over to you?" And they gave him 30 pieces of silver. What will you give me? Now, what's also very important about that is that Judas is the one who takes the initiative. There are some movies that suggest that Judas was corrupted by people who offered him money. In other words, they approached him. They thought maybe he would be weak and they could sway him into delivering Christ over. And so they went to him and they bribed him basically, or compromised him somehow. But that's not what we see in the Gospel of Matthew. And John supports this as a motivation, money. Because when we see in the Gospel of John, and this would be in chapter 12, we have the anointing at Bethany by Mary, the sister of Lazarus, the famous anointing in which a woman pours ointment over Jesus, and it's worth an unbelievable sum of money, a hugely expensive jar of ointment worth 300 denarii, someone says, which is a denarius was 1 day's wages. So it's like 10 months of wages for somebody, which was a lot of money, a lot of money. And somebody objects, and the Gospels say someone objects. Another Gospel say one of the 12 objected. So one Gospel is very vague. Another one says one of the 12. John says that the person who objected was Judas. Why wasn't this ointment sold and the money given to the poor? He says, John tells us that this was Judas, not because he cared for the poor, but because he held the money bag. In other words, he was the treasurer for the group. And John adds, he used to steal from whatever was inside of it. He was an embezzler. John tells us that. John, one of the 12, and he ought to know. And I think that there are times when sometimes in our lives, maybe you've had this experience where something doesn't seem right. You're involved with some kind of an organization or group or family, things go missing or something's not right. And you start to talk to other people and you put the pieces together and you figure out what really was happening, what this person was doing behind your backs. And this is what probably happened after the crucifixion. They found out that Judas had betrayed him. They sort of figured out that he had been stealing the money all along, that he sold the Lord for 30 pieces of silver and whatnot. Now, we find that rather difficult to understand because we love the Lord and we would never do that. But we have to remember that throughout human history, people have been motivated by greed. I mean, even today, people will murder someone for a relatively small amount of money. So we have to accept the fact of what the Gospels tell us, that the only motivation that we see is money. And as crass as that motivation may appear, that's the only thing we know of from the Scriptures. And I think we should believe it, okay, because we accept the testimony of the Scriptures and they certainly know. So the thing is, what does he sell Jesus out for? 30 pieces of silver. In the Old Testament, that is the price of a slave. And there's tremendous, we could say, poetic meaning behind that, theological meaning, because of course the Lord behaved like a slave. And he even told us, I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. So it's very significant that Judas receives the price of a slave, but who really became the slave? It was Judas himself who became the slave of the devil. There's something else very interesting about the 30 pieces of silver, and that is that the name Judas adds up to the number 30. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, perhaps you know that in the time of Christ, the Hebrew alphabet and the Greek alphabet did not have symbols for numbers the way we have today. We have symbols, but they're called Arabic numerals for a reason. The Arabs invented those. The things that when you picture the number 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever, those symbols came from Arabic times. Those are Arabic numerals. So at the time of Christ, in order to indicate a number, you took the letter of the Hebrew alphabet and you put a little mark next to it on the upper right-hand side. And Aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, was 1 with the mark. And Bayeth, the B, basically was 2, and etc. The Greeks did the same thing. Alpha was 1, Vita was 2, Gamma was 3, etc. And on down the line, Iota is 10, Lambda is 20, and we still use that numbering in the church. So if you are in church, in a Greek Orthodox church, and let's say you're looking at something side by side, and there's a service book that has the 50th Psalm, on the English side, it will say Psalm 50. On the Greek side, it will say N, the letter N, 50, Psalmos, 50. N is a number in the Greek numbering for 50. O is a letter for Omicron is 70. So if they're referring to the Septuagint, you'll see just as an abbreviation the letter capital O, which is the Greek number for 70. So we still see that in the Greek Orthodox Church. So if you could take anyone's name and you could spell out their name and the letters added up to a numerical equivalent. And if you spell out Judas, then it adds up to the number 30, quite ironically. Well, of course, Judas sold himself to the devil. He didn't get a lot of money for Christ. It's a pretty good sum of money, but you would think that he could have received more, but it certainly isn't enough to retire on or something like this. And as St. John Chrysostom pointed out, he didn't even live to enjoy it, because think about what happened. He goes to the chief priests and elders of the people and says, this is told to us by St. Matthew, what will you give me if I betray him to you, if I hand him over to you? That was on Wednesday. And of course, we know this because that's why we fast on Wednesdays, because that's the day the Lord was betrayed. And then Judas returned after the Lord had been condemned by the Jewish leaders and sentenced to death. And he returns to the temple on Friday, the day of preparation, when Jesus is standing before Pilate and about to be sent to the cross. So that's Friday, not even 2 days. So St. John Chrysostom correctly observes that he didn't live to enjoy it, either in this life or in the next life. Now, why did he betray Christ? We said because of money. We have to accept that. That's the historical record. Now, if he loved money so much, why did the Lord allow Judas to be the treasurer, especially if he was stealing from the group? Well, we could even go beyond that and ask ourselves, why did the Lord even choose Judas to be one of the 12? I mean, what a tremendous honor that was, right? We still talk about the apostles. We still revere the apostles. We have their icons everywhere. We have them in stained glass windows. Everybody talks about the 12 apostles. Why did the Lord even choose Judas to be one of the 12? Now, in order to answer this question, and St. John Chrysostom does answer this question, it's important for us to realize we cannot understand that because we are not spiritual people. And Chrysostom does explain it, I think, beautifully, because he is spiritual and he understands the mind of the Lord. Why did the Lord choose Judas? Judas, remember, nothing happened by accident. Everything was part of the plan of God. So why does he choose Judas? Because what Judas would end up doing would be a terrible thing. And the Lord gave Judas every opportunity to be saved. That's why. Now, there are people who have come to Orthodoxy from Protestant traditions and have told me that they were taught that Judas was born specifically for this purpose, to betray Christ. That's not true. And as a matter of fact, it's a terrible thing to say, because Judas went to hell. That's the consistent witness of the church. And he had free will. So to say that God had Judas be born so that he could betray Jesus, so that he could do something evil, that's impossible. It's impossible from an Orthodox theological perspective. Instead, what do we see consistently? The Lord welcomes Judas into the inner circle among the 12 so that he could see and know and experience everything that the others did. He saw everything. He saw the Lord walking on water. He saw the Lord stilling the storm. He not only heard the Lord preaching to the crowds again and again and again, seeing all those miracles that were performed, many, many things that were never written down in the New Testament that we don't even know about. Judas was privy to all of that. Judas was there when St. Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And the Lord blessed him and said that he was right. Judas was there for everything. Judas was among the 12 when the Lord sent out the 12, two by two. This is described in Matthew chapter 10, and also in Mark and in Luke. He sends out the disciples to preach that the kingdom of heaven is at hand and people should repent. They were preaching and they were healing and casting out demons. Judas did that too. Judas was there at the Last Supper. Judas received Holy Communion from the Lord. Judas's feet were washed by the Lord. I just want you to think about the enormity of that. I want you to think about the love and the patience of Christ, that every single day he saw Judas in front of him and he knew what Judas was going to do. And yet he still was patient and he did everything. He didn't deprive Judas of anything. We would have said, "Oh, you no good, dirty, rotten guy," something like that. But he never does. Not once. Not once. So, and I'll continue in a moment about this, but I just think that this is really something for us to marvel at, the patience of the Lord. And Chrysostom is exactly right. He wanted Judas to have every opportunity not to betray him, so that Judas could not say at the last judgment, "But I didn't know you were the Messiah, the Son of God. I didn't know. I was sort of just watching you and I betrayed you." No, he's in the inner circle. He knows everything that the 12 know. That when the Lord takes the 12 aside and teaches them privately and tells them the mysteries of the kingdom, Judas knows all of that. He knows everything. And yet he was more concerned with money. He was more devoted to money than to the Lord. That's what it comes down to. And everything that the Lord does, he doesn't single him out, even at the Last Supper. So what happens at the Last Supper?